Welcome, HIA members. Excited to be part of the webinar today. I've got an amazing co-host with me, Gary Rimler from Rimler Consulting and Risk Management. And my name's Joe Witte, Vice President of Partnerships and Ecosystems from TagOne. We're going to talk about reducing your risk and insurance with supply chain traceability. So, Gary, great to have you, buddy.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I'm excited to be a part of the conversation.
So Gary is a gem. He's a legend in the insurance industry, has more than 40 years experience, very innovative in the space and starting to drum up some unique ways to support the CBD and hemp industry. I've been an entrepreneur for close to 20 years, was in the service for 10 years, did one deployment overseas. And Gary and I think we connected after a webinar I did and we just had some really good conversations and saw some overlap on how supply chain transparency and insurance risk really overlap. And when we found out we're both in HIA, we approached Sarah and the team and said, hey, we got an idea and we're just really grateful that Hemp Insurance Association gave us this opportunity to talk to you guys. So just some high-level topics we're going to cover. We're going to talk about what's the risk climate look like for hemp and CBD, and what's that risk management process look like to make sure that you guys are protected and safe. Some of the differences between product liability and product recall. What are the biggest risks for you guys in hemp and CBD? How insurance is evaluated right now. It's a brand new industry. And what companies or what you guys can all do to reduce your risk, and how supply chain fits in this whole risk component and how technology can help you guys out. So Gary, kick us off, right? So for one, all of us define risk differently. You know, one person may have a high propensity for risk, another person may be very conservative and so thresholds are going to vary from person to person and company to company. How does the insurance sector view the hemp and CBD sector for risk? And even before that, how do we define risk in this sector?
Good questions, Joe. I think it's fair to start by defining risk as the uncertainty of economic loss. And it is also important, as we're probably going to talk during the session, about focusing on what has become called enterprise risk management. And enterprise risk management is putting your business under a microscope and determining what the risks are, what the interrelationship of different facets of your organization are, and what really means risk for your organization. Then put it in terms of dollars, but it is critical to do an analysis to identify your risk. As far as the hemp industry is concerned, you know, it's interesting. We've got a plant that goes back to the late 1800s, which is the topic of our discussion. And the insurance industry can't tell the difference between cannabis and hemp when someone is sitting in the C-suite. With over 100 industrial uses for hemp, well beyond CBD and edibles and food additives, the insurance industry is waking up a little bit. Some innovators are willing to insure hemp and some of hemp risks, but hemp sure is still misunderstood. And many insurers still make that connection, thinking cannabis, thinking classified drug as opposed to a deregulated industry in hemp that is like any other industry you might want to do business with.
It seems that, you know, I'm guessing the bean counters and the insurance providers, which all comes down to numbers, the less information they have, thus the less history, then the higher the level of risk, and that's probably the higher the premiums. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a very good assessment.
and being that hemp is still, even though it's been around for hundreds of years in the U.S., it's only been legal for a couple of years, and CBD is a relatively new product. So now we're just venturing into something new that's growing, and insurance companies are saying, "Hey, like we don't really know what to make of this, so we're not going to leave our neck, out for something to happen." Thus, maybe premiums are a little bit higher. But let's talk about ways that companies can even start to identify what their level of risk is. Like many people, myself included, may not even know, like, all right, when I start to look at my business holistically at a macro level, how and where do I start to do that? Can you give us a high level overview on what that process is that companies can take to identify their risks?
Yeah, it kind of simply begins with thinking, gee, what can go wrong? You have to pay attention to how you're sourcing your product. Are you sourcing your product from one spot and you're going to be in a tight position if anything happens to your supplier? Or are you multiple sourced, and if supplier A has problems, and just think back, how long ago was it that Japan experienced that major earthquake and the auto manufacturers were having trouble making their cars in the U.S. because they couldn't get the components out of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So in a similar analysis, I think you need to focus to where are you getting your ingredients from?
Right.
Where are you sourcing? What is the quality control guideline for those folks from whom you're sourcing your product? Are they practicing GMT?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have agreements as to what your responsibility is and what the supplier's responsibility is? Got to get that in writing.
Yep.
I think in an emerging industry, there's a phenomenal level of collaboration and trust. But at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, you need to be able to go back to a contract and find in that contract that your party agreed to indemnify you, and it clearly delineates what everyone's obligations are to each other.
Yep.
In this process, you also need to think about how much risk can you really afford to take, and do you want to self-insure? If we could quickly take a peek at, say, somebody who has a very large auto fleet, and as a result, they have a number of accidents every year, and those accidents are really very predictable. If that's the case, you really don't want to trade dollars with an insurance company, but you want to find that level that you're usually absorbing small claims and set a retention within your company and really only protect yourself against the catastrophe. Because if you trade dollars from the first dollar of loss with an insurance company, they're going to extract their pound of flesh when they look at the losses accumulated.
I can believe it. So it's interesting, now when you put in how to identify risk, it brought back some memories in the Army where we do, a risk, kind of a rubric, like, all right, let's think of an incident and what's the likelihood? Is it a high likelihood or low likelihood this happened? And then what's the risk level or kind of catastrophic level of this? This is like, hey, if this happens, it's an absolute disaster. Or if this happens, it's not that big of a deal. So, I mean, when you frame it that way, it makes it much more palatable and tangible about how to go through. And I think what you're referring to predominantly is product quality risk. If somebody takes this, can they die? Can they get sick? And oftentimes, I think in this industry, hemp and CBD, we say, hey, nobody dies from CBD. Okay, that may be true, but what about the different ingredients that are being blended with that? Is it like a coconut oil? There is an article that came out yesterday about a CBD company that had lead in their product from their packaging. So there's certain components that if we don't have experience or don't have somebody on our team who's run into these issues or heard of them before, who's doing regular testing, this is, I think, where company can get themselves in trouble. As well as connecting with the right professionals that can identify and look at, there's class action lawsuits going on for labeling claims. And like you said, maybe there's, toxins or something else in there. So it's really interesting you brought that up that way. And so something that maybe you can clarify for us is product liability and product recalls. And I think we probably on the surface can gather what the differences between the two, but from an insurance perspective, walk us through the differences from those and how we need to protect ourselves.
I very much would like to do that, but I'd like to take a small step backward. In relation to that risk management process and the enterprise risk management, something that has to be a component is crisis response.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you need to prepare a strategy and find a partner whom you could turn to that if an event has occurred, you've got a plan as to how to respond to it rather than having to start from scratch after the event occurs.
That's really important. And I imagine, now how many companies, let's say we're talking to a 50-person CBD company, is that something they would bring on somebody full-time to do or have a third-party resource? And how does somebody go about developing a plan for crisis response?
Well, certainly there's a consulting world who could help you build that. There are some very good crisis response companies. And actually, as you plan your insurance, the product liability or product recall, you can integrate into that insurance policy crisis response. So you can have it built in for you with the insurance product you purchase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So going to the difference between product liability and product recall, product liability will indemnify the business and is going to defend the business if someone gets hurt or if someone's property is damaged by what you did and how your product performed.
Got it.
We need to kind of think about contamination of products and what can cause sickness and what could cause physical damage. That is also really a component of product liability.
Yep, makes sense.
On the other hand, product recall is the withdrawal of product from the marketplace. It's you're realizing, I goofed, and now I got to bring the product back. And then where is your product? Who distributed it for you? Mm-hmm. You have a good lot plan where you could find the lots that were made and then reach out to the people to whom you sold those lots. So you're going to have to respond in having a withdrawal response plan to get out and make sure you're getting 100% or as close to 100% of the faulty product back. What is also going to happen is the distributors and the retailers may themselves recognize, hey, there's a problem with your product, mm-hmm. and they'll turn around and say, take this back. And the withdrawal expense and the cost to the retail business to bring that product back is something that they could hold the manufacturer accountable under recall withdrawal expense.
Yep. Interesting. So if it makes sense to me, product liability is, hey, somebody gets sick, they in turn sue the company. It's going to protect the company or cover maybe that lawsuit or medical bills, that type of thing. Now, in recall is helps cover, hey, you got to do a recall. With recall insurance, let's say, I actually heard a story. We actually did a webinar on recalls and returns on CBD and cannabis where our co-host talked about a cannabis company, not CBD, but they had to recall about $200,000 a product and destroy it. Would recall insurance cover the cost of the product you have to destroy? What exactly does it cover?
Yes, it would cover the expenses to withdraw the product,
okay,
the destruction of the product, the repositioning of the product, and reintroducing your product into the marketplace.
Got it, which is significant. I've heard stories about multi-million-dollar recall situations.
It very definitely, and I mean, tens of millions of dollars in some situations.
Yep.
Another element that you need to put in perspective in relation to the product recall risk is your own reputation.
Yes.
Because if there are questions about what you have in the market, well, you're going to want to make sure your reputation as a business is preserved so that you're viewed as somebody who makes a quality product and you can reposition your product and bring it back into the market.
Mm.
So the parties involved in relation to triggering a recall, you as a business are kind of the first point that you realize there's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the crib manufacturers who may realize that the separation of the bars in the cribs is too far,
right,
and there's an issue there. So they say, gee, we better get this back before somebody gets hurt.
Mm-hmm.
As I was talking, the customer identifies the problem, and then you got to take it back. I had a situation going back almost 10 years ago
mm-hmm.
where a major beverage manufacturer launched a new line of beverage. Their can manufacturer, who they used for their other products, goofed and forgot to properly install the liner inside the can.
Right.
So now these guys have a major product launch, and the cans are sweating and leaking. And now the customer finds this out and calls and says, hey, do you realize your cans are all wet? And they then needed to institute their plan to appropriately get the bad product off of the market and reintroduce the new brand, mm-hmm. working with the can manufacturer to support the refiguring of the product.
Mm. It's so interesting you mentioned about, we rely on so many different partners to get our product out and on the shelves or in consumers' hands. And a lot of our customers and people we're talking to, prospects, they use contract manufacturers, and we'll say like, hey, have you gone to their facility? No, actually I haven't, but they're GMP certified. And they're taking their word for it. And I think something that I've always lived by and learned on is trust but verify. I think it's really important that, we know who our partners are. We get eyes on their facility. And if they're not letting us in their facility, if they're not telling us who the ingredient providers are, then there may be an issue wrong. So I'm glad you brought up like something that, oh yeah, the inside product is good. What can go wrong with the can? What can go wrong with the bottle? And sure enough, things go wrong. And I know you mentioned even some uses of hemp that are not going to be imbibed, there where things can still go wrong there. Like, what are some other potential issues that can happen with hemp?
Well, certainly there's a growing world of clothing sourced through hemp, and there are also certain flammability problems with clothing and treatments of the clothing to avoid the flammability. So you can have an issue where you're finding those problems in the clothing sector. You could have an industrial use of the hemp product. You know, you take the herd and you turn around and you use that as your foundation for manufacturing building materials, and then you find the building materials are not meeting the strength or durability promises of the product, and
Right.
you have to step in and do something.
Really interesting. And just to continue, as it relates to more the consumable product, as it typically is going into hemp foods or nutraceuticals or supplements or CBD, what are some of the major risks and issues that companies need to be aware of or that you're hearing about or seeing?
Well, the supply chain itself and being able to identify potential issues in relation to the supply chain becomes a critical issue. As I sit down with insurance companies trying to build product liability coverage or the recall insurance, they want to know what is the company doing in sourcing its product. How can they find a responsible party if something has happened in the supply chain and sourcing process?
Right.
It also becomes very important when there's contamination from foreign objects. Who was responsible for the presence of that foreign object? Was there ground glass that made its way into the sugar that was used as a sweetener? And can you find out who your sweetener source was?
Yep. Yeah, there was a similar issue, I think, in the like early 2010s where ground peanut shells were being put into cumin to adulterate, and because I think there's a cumin shortage, and of course, anybody who knows somebody with a peanut allergy, which these days there's a lot of people, was just a significant issue. That's really interesting.
Exactly. The other thing is you're going to get sometimes wrong ingredients put in, and there I think it might be called something like a bench error, where somebody went and pulled from the rack what they thought was the food ingredient, and instead they accidentally grabbed a chemical, and now you've got contamination because of somebody not paying attention as they were collecting the ingredients to manufacture. Going back to what you were saying a little bit ago in relation to that contract blender or contract manufacturer, you need to think again about, did you complete a legal agreement with that contract manufacturer that contains an indemnity provision that is sufficiently clear, saying, hey, if I did this wrong, I'm going to indemnify you.
Right.
And then not only am I going to indemnify you, I'm going to have insurance in force, and my insurance will also protect you. And you know what? I'll make my insurance primary and use it first ahead of any of your own insurance.
That's
very important points to keep in mind as you're putting all this supply chain, contract processing, all these pieces of the puzzle.
That advice is so sage, where oftentimes, especially in this industry, where it's new, it's growing, the opportunities are pretty significant. We want to be first, and thus we want to move fast. But oftentimes moving fast means not doing our diligence, and maybe we don't look at 4 or 5 different potential contract manufacturers. Maybe we're not looking closely at all their documentations and looking at C of A's closely for every single lot number. And as a result, mistakes are being made. I mean, there was a study that came out not too long ago that analyzed 47 different CBD brands and found that maybe it was like 50% of those had between 85 and 105% of the properly labeled amount of CBD, right? And in some industries, even that's not good. If it's not, 90, 95 to 105, you're wrong. But there were 10% that had no CBD, another 10% that had, less than 30% CBD. So, another source of significant lawsuits have been CBD companies that say, oh, it's THC free. And then somebody takes it and then they flag for THC for their job and they get fired. That's an issue. And then, of course, there's medical claims being made, which we just can't make medical claims yet for CBDs. And of course, these result in lawsuits. So I imagine these are some of the significant risks in the industry. Anything else you want to add here before we can talk about how insurance providers are evaluating, what they're going to, what the costs are?
Yeah, there are a couple of points. First of all, a known risk in relation to the hemp plants and the biomass is that the nature of the plant in the field is that it's going to suck up impurities in the soil. And if it was used as a cow pasture, or there were a variety of fertilizers and other elements that got introduced into that soil or into the water supply underground sourcing or the irrigation systems, there are going to be heavy metal and other impurities that can make its way all the way through if the quality control procedures are not properly in place. But the other point I wanted to make, and that should not be forgotten, is protect your intellectual property. Because as you may turn to suppliers, or as you may turn to contract processors, are you getting non-compete agreements? Are you getting protection that you've contractually protected yourself, that somebody is not going to steal your technology and your product?
That's a great point. And yeah, the fact that it's a cleaning crop, or what type of water are you using? What type of tools are you using to harvest it? Have they been cleaned? Did you clean, did you run one other crop with something else that, can cross-contaminate? There's just so many different things to think about, which, the insurance industry will think about. So how is the insurance industry evaluating hemp and CBD right now? And how can somebody, if there's a listener in the industry now, how can they try to get an idea about, man, what type of insurance do I need and what's it going to cost me?
Yeah, so if we look at the product liability risk, the question is, how is your product used? What is your product? How do you define your product? How do you source your product? How do you control your supply chain? Is blockchain enforced as a control? What are your defined written quality control procedures? The more you could show you have written quality control procedures, that you use certified QA labs, that you have the food processing and the GMP procedures in place. Are you GMP compliant? Mm-hmm. All those lead into the analysis of the risk. The soft issues, does the insurance company feel comfortable enough to offer insurance?
Okay.
The next point is, what has your history been? Have you been operating your business properly and you really have not had any losses to date? Or the ones you've had, you controlled real fast? or if you got a frequency going on of claims or a limited number of very severe claims, the insurance companies are going to take out their sharp pencils and start adding extra charges when they are uncomfortable and uncertain if you are able to control your business going forward. And then, the insurance companies are not the bad guys that they get portrayed to be all the time. A good partnership with your insurance company, with the claims departments, doing planning in advance, identifying defense counsel and who's going to handle your claims. All these are ingredients that go into controlling the cost of your insurance, the credit you get to thinking this through in advance. And then the insurance company is going to say, okay, I'm going to charge you 0.6% or 6% of sales,
right,
in order to purchase the product liability insurance.
Interesting. And so that's product liability. What would a company expect if they need recall insurance in this industry right now?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. What would a company expect if they needed recall insurance versus product liability?
Well, one very important point that makes it a little time consuming is not all of the companies who provide product liability provide product recall.
Okay.
The product recall world in a lot of ways is in what is called the contingency insurance market.
Okay.
And that market has been totally battered by event cancellations, by the COVID-19 issues. They have been responding to contaminations and other issues that have occurred over the last 6 months or so.
Right.
And as a result, this sector of the market is bleeding. So the number of people offering product like recall insurance has become a little limited, and the amount of a recall policy they're offering is becoming limited. So in acquiring the product recall insurance, you're almost going to go through the same analysis process with insurers as for the product liability insurance.
Interesting. Now, are these negotiable? Are there certain negotiable points? Are there certain things that, and I guess we're going to get into it next, what's negotiable and what can companies do to reduce their risk and thus their premiums?
So the starting point is to put yourself in the best possible light. You want to show yourself as much as possible as a leader and innovator in your industry, as opposed to someone who's always playing catch up. You want to show that you have historically in your company paid attention to safety, paid attention to avoiding losses, complied with GMP, complied with the health and safety regulations, and show you have a plan to mitigate losses now. It's not that you're going to first think about it when something happens. And you're going to show that you have planned how you're going to defend because you have partnered or associated with a law firm that understands your industry and understands the legal issues and is completely prepared to respond on your behalf in a common sense way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And as far as the diligence process, what should a company expect? How much time, how much stuff are they going to have to get together? How long is it going to take, that they're going to have to give to an insurance provider, as they're going through this process?
Gosh, that's hard to answer. How much time is it going to take? But I think somebody has got to dedicate a good couple of days working with a good trusted partner
Mm-hmm.
to prepare this material and to make sure that when the insurance company is engaged, they're openly accepting the business as opposed to throwing it in the bottom drawer.
Yep.
One of the things we do is we provide an executive summary and underwriting overview for the insurance companies to address so many of the issues that we're talking about.
Right.
So we give a roadmap to the insurance companies. And these days, more than any time in the last 10 years, because the insurance market was so loose and so not paying attention to underwriting standards, now the market has become really, really restricted, and underwriters are afraid to lose their job if they write something.
Right.
So you've got to do just an extraordinary job to make sure that your company goes to the top of the pile
Mm-hmm.
in queuing up for the insurance.
That's really interesting. We're talking about how to reduce risk, and now you even just mentioned, man, just you want to get insurance, and if you don't have your act together, it may be difficult. So, when we developed our technology at TagOne, which is an integrated supply chain platform, we'll get into it a little in a second. It wasn't until after talking to you that I realized just how significant that transparency and traceability on knowing your supply chain, who your suppliers are, who your buyers are, which the FDA just came out with the new era of smarter food, and tech traceability was at the top of the list. What's your documentation associated with that was so important to insurance providers to know that. It actually was kind of pulling back the curtain, as you may say. Now, we applied blockchain technology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about tech traceability in a second, but just before I do, because you did mention blockchain before, just so the audience understands, what is blockchain, because there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of definitions. So most people have heard of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is an application to fintech. Don't associate blockchain just with Bitcoin. Blockchain, think of it as an immutable database where you can send data, content, documents, whatever it may be, and a 64-digit alphanumeric code is randomly assigned to that, like a thumbprint. And if you change that data in any capacity, you make a space or add a period, that code will automatically change. And it's in a third-party provider that nobody can access. In our case, it's a private blockchain, which means only your company can access the data, and then only they can access the blockchain, but you can't change it. It would be almost like a permanent red line document, if you may. So the benefits of using blockchain technology, and we'll get into the practical ones, but the benefits are, if you're audited and the data is in there, who's ever doing the auditing, whether it's internal or external, we know that data is what it is, all right? And so that's as a result, when you're sharing information with your partners and suppliers, product provenance. Hey, our inventory list, our supply chain management, you can feel very confident in what we're putting on here is accurate. So we applied blockchain. It's supply chain management is a great application for blockchain technology. And let me go back real quick. Gary, how do you see the use in insurance of how blockchain can apply from the insurance perspective and risk lens?
Well, the importance of blockchain is that it gives you the roadmap. It allows you to go back and trace the path from the beginning to the manufacturing time.
Hmm.
So it is essential to be able to go back and, if you would, prove what went into the product.
That's I actually skipped ahead to this because you brought it up. We'll go back to document management in a second, but an important component of what TagOne does and what makes us a little bit different from other tech traceability platforms is we can handle complex transactions, right? It's not just tracking a tomato from farm to the plate. Hemp is usually mixed with 3 to 4 to 5 other ingredients. So here's our what we call our visual map, where you can see, let's say in blue here, this is the final product and this is your buyer, all the different ingredients that went into this. And then not only your supplier, but your supplier's supplier, or if you're vertically integrated, it could be, hey, you grew it from this hemp farm and it was extracted here and processed here and manufactured here. Some of these you may own, some you may have a partner. You can click on it and see when the transaction date took place, what's the lot number, drill down further, what's the C of A associated with that. So to have all that and know that it's provenant and connected to your inventory management system, I think is just something that we found our customers in this industry really needed. And as you can see, by having and tracking all this surgically, now on the flip side, our recall and return system is very surgical. So, I've heard stories, and we did on our recall webinar about people who didn't know who had what lot number. And I found that to be surprising, but sadly, it's very common. So guess what they have to do? They have to recall everything from everybody that's ever bought something from them, which is expensive and time consuming, versus saying, okay, this lot number from this supplier of MCT oil was expired. Let's see what lot number that went into of ours and who has it. Now we only need to recall that. And that may be a fraction of everything, and thus saves you time, saves you money, and saves your reputation. So that was an important component of why we kind of, hey, let's slow things down and do them right, and thus that reduces risk and puts you in a position to win long term. I imagine in the insurance world, proper documentation is really important. Talk a little bit about what's important in this industry as well as other industries to help companies reduce risk.
Well, we certainly are talking the supply chain elements. The other is the quality of your ingredients, your knowledge and experience in your industry, your ability to complete and meet deadlines, and have your product arrive at the distributor level on time, that things are not being rushed where problems can occur, that you have your quality assurance team testing your products either randomly or frequently in what's coming off of your manufacturing the lines.
Awesome. So, as with anything that happens, GMP is all about documentation. What are your standard operating procedures? Where can you find certain transaction documentation, C of A's? Is it organic? Well, where's the certification? Managing documents in any business, but especially in this industry, frankly, it's a pain. And we've got one client we're onboarding now that just prints everything and puts it in binders. And that's one of the reasons why they're joining us. And it's hard to connect, whether it's in a binder or even in Dropbox, with lot numbers. All right, I've got a lot number. How does that lot number connect with the C of A? And how does that C of A connect with the supplier? And how does all the certifications and documentation of that supplier connect? And then that supplier has 3 different locations. Each location, to be GMP certified, needs to have its own documentation. So in order to help reduce your risk and simplify your process and save you a heck of a lot of time, TagOne developed a whole document organization process to store all your C of A certification purchase orders in there. And one thing that I hadn't really thought of when I first joined the company is expiration dates. You put a document in Dropbox or Google Drive, it's not going to remind you when that so important C of A or that organic certification expires from your supplier. And if 2 years go by and you're still making claims to be organic and you get audited and their organic certification expired, they're not organic anymore, that's a potential issue, right? So that's why we put a lot of emphasis on tying your document management to all the rest of your configuration and supply chain. So just want to kind of wrap up. We're going to get in a recap and wrap up on, man, when we look at the risk that CBD and hemp companies face today, it's significant. You know, we focus today on the insurance component. And we're still looking in this in. Gary and I hope to roll some things out, but we think that, you know, insurance premiums can be reduced. We don't know that number. Kind of put 15% on here now, but don't hold us to that. But certainly by analyzing your risk, as Gary talked about, and doing risk analysis, providing the right technology and systems and the right people and experts in there can reduce the likelihood of recalls as well as the impact of a recall and return. Audits should be a whole lot easier. We have one client, Gary, he's actually out in Colorado, a honey company, and they came in and we're doing an audit, and he showed them the QR codes they had on their honey, and the guy scanned it, and the C of A was right in there. And the guy's like, I've never seen that before. That's amazing. I'll see you in 5 years. So, you know, using modern technology to simplify, you can reduce the stress level, you know, and provide better clarity and agility and help you identify trends of issues. If you have everything digitally in your system, you may see from one supplier CBD levels going down or THC levels going up, and you say, hey, supplier, I've been tracking this for the last year. What's going on? Do we need to change seed? I just want to let you know, otherwise I got to change suppliers. What are some other areas that you feel having a good visibility in your supply chain can help reduce risk for companies, Gary?
Well, I think we've been hitting the points very well, but the investment in identifying the risks to the organization is invaluable. That ability to display a QR code and be able to nail down the QR code and being able to express that capability to your insurer. You keep in mind, your insurer is a partner of yours. They're not an adversary. And letting them know that you're going to cover their spot by being able to deliver certain items that are going to reduce the risk after the claim, after the fact, is just invaluable.
And I think to add to that, just something to think about for the audience too. Hey, listen, when you're reducing your risk, and thus it really means doing things the right way and having quality, that's something you want to share with your customers too. Like, businesses are all related, right? If you've got good process, a great supply chain, you know, good technology, great people, great systems, that's something you can bring to your customers to build confidence with them and differentiate yourself in the market, because rest assured, not everybody is doing that. So, Gary, kind of give us a quick recap. I know we talked about a lot of different things today. What are some parting thoughts you want to give to the audience about, you know, risk alleviation and how this fits into their overall strategy and how it fits into their insurance plans as well?
Well, I think one of the very first points is don't fear risk. Analyze and know your risk and be able to manage your risk, be able to transfer your risk to those responsible for creating that risk for you. It aids in helping you manage the risk. You want to find ways to self-fund and retain risk when you're comfortable that you can manage your risk. hemp is still considered high risk and unknown by so much of the insurance industry. So remember, you've got to display yourself in the absolute best possible light
Right.
and show that you really know how to control your risk. And when you've got the ability to get to that point, take informed risk. Don't be bashful about self-insurance and certain risk retention techniques. Sometimes it's as simple as taking $5,000 deductible rather than $1,000 deductible on your product liability insurance, or taking a $25,000 on your property insurance deductible rather than $5,000, and bank those savings yourself for a rainy day.
That's great. I love the way you phrase transferring your risk to your partners, right? If somebody's providing a product or service to you, that means they need to be responsible for and own their share of that. And I think we talked about it before in the conversation. I can't remember if it came up today, but that means making sure that they have the proper insurance coverage and passing that on to them, right? Like, hey, by the way, Mr. MCT oil vendor or contract manufacturer, great, we're about to do a contract. I need to make sure you have $5 million in liability insurance or recall insurance if this needs to happen. And that's a requirement if we're going to do business together. It's something like really smart you shared before. I'm like, yeah, that makes complete sense. And on the tech side, what I realized, technology can do, and what our technology provides, is it centralizes all the information in one area, which in essence is providing transparency and traceability in one central location. So if you're an executive, you know where everything is at a quick keystroke. You can find it, it's there, along with, your insurance provider if you need to pull something up quickly, or somebody who's conducting an audit. Thus, as a result, it's all easy to find, it's all can be validated, reducing that risk. This was awesome. So, we're going to conclude here. Again, if you guys have questions for Gary about insurance, if you need insurance, I'm going to talk to Gary a little bit further. These are ways you can get in touch with Gary. His phone number and email are posted here. Same thing with me. If you'd just like to talk a little bit more about how, our integrated supply chain technology for hemp to CBD track and traceability can support you, shoot me an email. Our company phone number is down below. My direct cell, I'll leave it here, 215-359-8898. Go to our websites to find out more about us. Gary, anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I very much would welcome chatting with anybody and extend an olive branch that feel free to reach out, ask questions, second opinions, bounce situations off of me. I'd be happy to point you to where you can find a solution, or maybe within our consulting organization and our understanding in the insurance world, we can help you and we can bring solutions to your table. So very much enjoyed chatting and sharing information today. There's a whole lot of stuff we haven't touched upon. Maybe we could do phase 2 sometime.
I'd love
but please
to, Gary.
Send us emails and ask your questions.
You got it. We're here for you, everybody. And if you have questions, send it out to us right away. Thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.